This is nursing care of the child with an alteration in behavior, cognition, or development. So what influences a child's behavior? First, your biology, your genetics have a lot to do with your temperament. Nutrition. Did the child get adequate nutrition, especially during those first years of life? Physical health. Are kids with chronic illnesses just, it gets them behind in everything else? A developmental disability, or what their abilities are. Environmental and family interactions. Are they living in the middle of a high-stress environment? And then their individual temperament and how the parents respond to the child's behaviors will influence that child's behaviors. So let's start with learning disabilities. This is defined as a child performing at a lower academic level than expected for their innate intelligence. So this means when we test them, their aptitude is here, their performance is down here. So there's a gap between the two. Children who have chronic illnesses are 2 times as likely to have a learning disability, and that kind of makes sense. They're going to be missing school. They're just not getting, they may have the aptitude, but they're not getting what they need to achieve because of that illness. So there are different types of learning disabilities. Dyslexia is usually having to do with reading, includes writing and spelling. Dyscalculia is mathematics, a disability with number sense. Dyspraxia is manual dexterity and coordination. Dysgraphia is producing written words, so being able to write. They can explain what they mean, but if they can't put it into writing. And then there are others that are just not clearly one of these types. So moving on, someone with an intellectual disability, and that's the term our book is going to use. Cognitive impairment is also frequently used. Now, this used to be called mental retardation and then developmental disability. Mental retardation just is too stigmatizing, and developmental disability is too nonspecific. We're talking about cognitive. So either cognitive impairment or intellectual disability. This has a definition using an IQ test. And if you remember from math, from stats, your normal bell-shaped curve, right? We set the mean at 100 and a standard deviation at 15. So this is somebody who's getting close to 2 standard deviations below the mean to diagnose them as an intellectual disability. So IQ test, they come out 70 to 75 or lower. Has to have at least 2 areas where it's impacted. Their life is impacted by their disability. So communication, community use, being able to go out, get around, use buses, things like that. Functional academics doesn't mean they have to do well, but they have to be able to read road signs, be able to read stickers, price stickers on things, stuff like that. Health and safety, can they take care of themselves? Home living, can they live safely by themselves? Leisure, can they fill up their day with something that appeals to them? Self-care, can they brush their teeth, bathe themselves, dress themselves? Self-direction, can they make enough decisions to care for themselves? Social skills, can they interact with people? Work, this doesn't mean a 40-hour work week, but can they engage in meaningful activities and work? And it has to happen before the age of 18 and be in impact at least 2 areas. If it happens later, they probably had a traumatic brain injury. So that's just a different category it would fall under. So for intellectual disabilities, we do base it on that IQ test. Mild is considered 50 to 70 on that test. Remember, mean is 100. Standard deviation 15. So moderate 35 to 50. Severe is under that, usually 20 to 35. And profound is below 20. So some things that can cause this, fetal alcohol syndrome, and this is from exposure to alcohol in utero. At this point, we know not every baby who's exposed to alcohol has problems, but we don't know what the safe amount is, so we recommend no alcohol exposure. Baby with fetal alcohol syndrome, there's a typical look to them, the kind of a flat bridge to the nose, so it's kind of flat and then a sudden upturned nose. The whole mid face is kind of flat. The along here is, again, flat with a very narrow upper lip. They have poor coordination, can have skeletal anomalies, can have a small head, microcephaly, often failure to thrive, often hearing loss. And here's a picture of a baby very typical of that, the wide set eyes with everything kind of flat through the middle of the face. Moving on to autism, we're now saying 1 in 88 children has autism or something on the spectrum. It is a spectrum. There's a range from mild to severe. We don't know what causes this. We know it's not immunizations. A lot of people still are wondering if that's the cause. That's been studied very well. In fact, the doctor who first wrote the article in the Lancet that started that has lost his medical privileges. So we know it's not immunizations, but we don't know what it is. So what is autism? Well, impaired social interaction, impaired communication, perseveration, and this is fixating on one thing. So these kids have a lot of trouble transitioning from one activity to another. So it's really important to help them with transitions. Don't just suddenly go turn the TV off on them, because they do that, perseveration. Repetitive behaviors, this is often kind of self-stimulation, the rocking, moaning, head banging, things like that. It interferes with developing interpersonal relationships, and they become socially isolated. So warning signs of autism: lack of eye contact, not babbling by 12 months because they're just kind of disconnected from other humans. Not pointing or using gestures by 12 months. No single words by 16 months. No 2 words put together by 24 months. And actually, some kids with autism do begin using words, and then they regress and stop using them. And it's usually around 18 months, which is when we give the MMR shot, which is kind of why that developed that thought of could it be. So losing the language skills. So nursing interventions for families who have a child with autism. Provide them emotional support. Raising kids is hard. Raising a kid with special needs is harder. And these are not warm, fuzzy, cuddly, loving babies and toddlers. And so it makes it that much harder. So provide professional guidance and education. Make sure they understand that they're not blaming themselves or blaming their child. Make sure the treatment plan we have fits with this child's needs. Help the parents to overcome barriers so that they are getting the education, developmental, and behavioral treatment programs they need. Getting these children diagnosed properly and into programs can be hard because they look normal. So helping parents get those supports. These kids need rigid, unchanging routines. They do not tolerate change, spontaneous, so helping parents to implement that, and helping the parents get respite care. You can't just have some 16-year-old babysitter who isn't going to follow any of the routines you do. You've got to have somebody who understands how to work with an autistic child. So get them appropriate respite care, and then provide feedback and just how to work with their child. It is hard and it's taxing and draining, and yet they love their child. So give them the feedback they need. Again, you can't tell what child is autism, and that can be one of the problems. This is where you get people in public staring at you for letting your child act like that, because the child looks normal, and so they don't realize what's going on. Attention deficit. They say this is nearly 10% of children. So the characteristics, it affects attention. They are inattentive, impulsive, distractible, and hyperactive. And you can have some of those in much greater, it's not equal proportions of each of those. In fact, for girls, often they are much more inattentive and less with the impulsive and hyperactive. Oops. So this is just a video if you want to watch. So how are we going to help these kids? They need limits. You need to hold them to responsible behavior. Realize it's harder for them than other kids. So be realistic. Don't argue, bargain, negotiate. Make limits. Stick with them. Have the same daily routine so life is predictable. Use a low-pitched voice. This means don't scream. So talk normally, remain calm. Screaming and yelling doesn't help them to stay on track, and it doesn't help you to deal with it. Redirecting their attention. They get distracted so easily, so getting them back on track. And if you can have some clues, you go and you tap the table in front of them or something that triggers them, so it doesn't have to be this calling them out in front of their friends that they're have lost their attention. Trying to ignore inappropriate behaviors as much as possible, as long as everybody's safe, and praise them for their self-control efforts. It's hard for them. And in the hospital, we're only going to use restraints when necessary, and parents too. They shouldn't be pinning their kid down to get them under control unless it's necessary. So moving on to abuse, child maltreatment. This includes physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect. And the most common actually is neglect. So this is failing to provide the child's needs for food, clothing, shelter, medical care, and schooling. We'll look at each of these a little bit. Children just realize they love their parent. They don't want their parent taken away from them. Part of that's out of guilt, and part of it's just out of love. So they don't want to tell you or admit that their parent has hurt them. Abuse does happen in all socioeconomic levels, but it is most prevalent in poor families with ongoing stress. Children under 3, because they're frustrating sometimes, right? They're harder. And then families who have a lot of stress, don't have a lot of coping skills, you add that together and you can see how it happens more often here. Most common perpetrators are parents or caregivers. Risk factors, again, it's living in a very stressful environment. So poverty, babies who are preterm, especially if there's medical needs, children with cerebral palsy, CP, or any other chronic illness, children who have an intellectual disability, so they can't understand, they're not catching on, it gets frustrating, the parent doesn't have coping skills. Parents who are abused themselves as a child, they haven't learned anything else. Alcohol or substance abuse in the household, and then extreme stress. So if we can alleviate some of those problems, and give the parent the support and the coping skills they need, we may be able to save some of these kids. There are specific places that you should be suspicious when you see injuries. And they didn't say the face, you grab a child like that if you leave bruises on both sides or hitting them in the face. There are places kids don't fall. They fall and bang their foreheads, but not the rest of the face. Munchausen by proxy. This is the parent who is seeking medical care for their child who doesn't have a problem. So they're actually causing the problem. You take the child away from the parent and there are no medical issues. So that's what we're doing. We're in the hospital. Nothing happens unless the parent is with the child unsupervised. That's where we should be worried. These kids, fairly high percent of them, a percentage of them will die from this, so it's important to intervene. Substance abuse usually happens before age 20, and there are risk factors. Let's help these kids to prevent this from happening. So families where there is substance abuse already, the kids are more likely